The Villain's Last Life. Part 1. Rebirth was supposed to be quiet. Evander Shen died at 28 with blood in his mouth, a sword through his side, and his former lover staring at him like the world had just split open. It was, Evander thought in hindsight, an irritatingly dramatic way to go. In his last life, he had been feared across the cultivation world under another name, one spoken with enough dread to silence halls and empty courtyards. He had built himself into a villain the world could not ignore. Beautiful, dangerous, clever enough to turn sex against each other, and cruel enough to survive the aftermath. He had spent years climbing through blood, betrayal, and war, only to end at the edge of a cliff with the righteous hero finally arriving too late to save him from himself. He still remembered the hero's face, the white robes stained red, the shaking hand around the sword, the look in those eyes when Evander smiled and stepped backward into empty air. Then everything had gone dark. When he opened his eyes again, he was no longer in a world of spirit veins and immortal sections. He was in Vesper City, a glittering coastal metropolis of glass towers, suspended rail lines, floating ad holos, and private sky lanes where the rich commuted above the traffic. The air no longer smelled of incense and blood. It smelled of rain on polished steel, expensive coffee, and the faint ozone tang of charging transit ports. More importantly, nobody here wanted him dead. It was wonderful. This life's Evander Shen was 22, beautiful in a cold, lazy way, and the only son of Lin Shen, a florist with a sharp eye, a soft heart, and a frightening ability to see through every lie he told. He had also inherited a vast trust from his late father's side. Old money, old biotech shares, private holdings, a penthouse in his name, and enough passive income to ensure that if Evander wanted to spend the rest of his life doing absolutely nothing, he absolutely could. Naturally, that was exactly what he wanted. He attended Asterian University only because it was easier than listening to his mother complain about him, rotting elegantly in bed. He technically lived in a luxury penthouse in the upper district, but in practice he spent most of his time in the sunlit apartment above his mother's flower shop because she fed him, bullied him into eating vegetables, and filled the rooms with the kind of warmth he had never known in his first life. It was a peaceful arrangement. Evander woke late, skipped half his lectures, and perfected the art of looking too expensive and too irritated for anyone to bother him. He liked long baths, quiet balconies, silk sleepwear, and pretending the world did not exist. He had no desire to touch power again. No desire for old wars, old grief, or old lovers. The universe, however, had always found him funniest when he was suffering. The disaster began on a rainy Thursday. Evander was sprawled on the back lounge of the flower shop, one arm over his eyes, lazily scrolling through messages from his financial advisor and ignoring every single one. His mother's voice floated up from downstairs. "Evander!" He made a tired sound of protest. "Come down here for a minute." "No. I have a new customer." "That sounds like a you problem." "He's handsome." Evander pulled the arm off his face and stared at the ceiling. "Mother, I am begging you to stop trying to improve my life. You're 22 and allergic to sunlight. Come downstairs. I'm preserving my peace." "You're being dramatic." Evander rose with the suffering dignity of a persecuted prince and went downstairs in black lounge pants, an oversized knit shirt, and a mood dark enough to curdle milk. He stepped into the flower shop and stopped. The man standing near the front counter was tall in the way expensive architecture was tall. Broad-shouldered, sun-warm, impossible not to notice. He had dark hair that curled slightly at the ends, an easy athletic build, and the kind of face people probably trusted within 5 seconds of meeting him. He wore a fitted charcoal coat over a cream sweater, one hand resting against the counter as he listened to Lin May speak. Then he turned. Amber eyes met Evander's. The world lurched. Not because the man looked like the hero from Evander's last life. He didn't. This face was different, softer, warmer, less severe than the sword Saint Evander remembered. But the soul beneath it, Evander knew it instantly. The vase in his hand slipped. The stranger crossed the room in one smooth movement and caught it before it shattered, his other hand closing around Evander's wrist. Warm fingers, steady grip. For one sickening second, Evander was back on a blood-soaked mountain with another hand around his wrist and a voice saying his name like a prayer and a wound. "Careful," the man said softly. Evander looked up. The stranger was staring at him now, no longer smiling. Something naked and stunned had cracked through his expression, like recognition striking before reason. "Evander," he said, almost under his breath. Evander's pulse slammed against his ribs. He snatched his hand back. His mother, oblivious to the fact that Evander had just found the reincarnation of his dead righteous hero X in her flower shop, beamed brightly. "Perfect, you've met. Evander, this is Cassian Vale." He just moved into the building across the street. Of course he had. Of course fate had not only dragged the hero back into Evander's life, but installed him within walking distance of the family business. Cassian recovered quickly, though his eyes stayed fixed on Evander's face with unsettling intensity. Then he smiled. A warm, devastating smile that should have come with legal restrictions. "Hi," he said, offering a hand. "Cassian." Evander looked at it like it was diseased. "Evander." Cassian's smile widened, absurdly pleased by this minimal exchange. "That's a beautiful name." Evander blinked once. "I know." Lin Mei made a strangled sound that suspiciously resembled laughter. Cassian, the lunatic, looked delighted. He had come to order flowers for an elderly neighbor who had helped him move into his apartment. It was the sort of thoughtful gesture that would have made most people trust him instantly. Evander, who had once run a criminal network across 3 territories, trusted no one and least of all men who looked kind on purpose. Unfortunately, Lin Mei adored him in under 10 minutes. Cassian was polite. Cassian carried boxes without being asked. Cassian fixed the jammed smart lock on the back storage door after seeing Lin Mei struggle with it for 30 seconds. Cassian complimented her arrangements with enough sincerity that she started calling him dear before the hour was over. Evander watched the betrayal unfold from behind the register with growing despair. At one point Cassian glanced at a crooked display rack, rolled up his sleeves, and adjusted it with easy competence. Lin Mei sighed. "What a good boy." Evander nearly choked on his own tea. Cassian turned, caught his expression, and smiled with such blinding sweetness that Evander briefly considered homicide. This was bad. No, this was catastrophic. Because Evander remembered exactly what the righteous hero had been like beneath all that virtue and discipline. In public, he had been the untouchable golden son of the cultivation world. In private, he had been intense to the point of madness. Possessive, devoted, impossible to shake once he'd decided someone mattered to him. And if Cassian Vale was truly that same soul reborn, then Evander's quiet second life was about to be strangled to death by relentless affection and boundary violations. By the time Cassian finally left with his flowers, Lin Mei was smiling in a way Evander deeply distrusted. "No," he said at once. She blinked. "No what?" "No whatever idea you're having. I was only going to say he seems lovely. He seems suspicious. He bought flowers for a widow." "Exactly. A flawless cover." Lin Mei laughed. "For what?" Evander opened his mouth, realized he could not say for stalking me across lifetimes, and settled for being annoying. That night he lay awake in the penthouse he technically owned but rarely used, staring through the wall-length windows at Vesper City's skyline. Aircars glided between towers like ribbons of light. Holographic ads shimmered over the harbor. Somewhere below, the city pulsed with life. Sleek, modern, safe. This world had given him a second chance. Wealth, peace, a mother who loved him, a future with no blood in it. He was not going to let one overgrown heroic idiot ruin that. The next morning, he went downstairs to find Cassian in his mother's kitchen making breakfast. Evander stood in the doorway in silk sleep pants and stared. Cassian, wearing one of Lin Mei's aprons and looking offensively good in it, looked up from the stove and smiled like the sun itself had decided to become unbearable. "Morning, Evander." Lin Mei sat at the table with tea and an expression of complete betrayal. Cassian came by to return the vase deposit and offered to make pancakes. Evander looked at the pancakes, then at Cassian, then at his mother. I want you both to know, he said flatly, that I'm being targeted. Cassian laughed. Lin Mei pushed a mug of coffee toward him. Sit down and stop pouting. I'm not pouting. I'm experiencing justified suspicion. Cassian set a plate in front of him. Try one first. You can accuse me after. Evander glared at the pancake like it had personally insulted him. Then he ate it. It was infuriatingly excellent. Cassian looked so pleased by this tiny victory that Evander had to look away before he did something regrettable. Like throw the syrup at him. This was how it started, he thought with deep foreboding. Not with swords. Not with vengeance. Not with fate declaring itself under storm-dark skies. No. In this life, apparently the hero had decided to invade through breakfast. And Evander was already losing. Part 2. The hero arrives with flowers and boundary issues. By the end of the week, Cassian Vale had become a problem of national importance. Evander had survived sect wars, assassination attempts, poisonings, and one spectacularly hostile alliance banquet that ended with a chandelier on fire. None of that had prepared him for a cheerful himbo with broad shoulders, golden retriever energy, and the social instincts of a man who believed all closed doors were merely decorative. Cassian texted too much. Cassian smiled too easily. Cassian somehow managed to look heartbreakingly sincere every time Evander threatened him with bodily harm. Worst of all, Cassian had won over Lin Mei completely. On Saturday morning, Evander came downstairs and found Cassian carrying flower crates from the delivery van to the shop's cold storage, while his mother supervised with all the delight of a woman who had acquired a new favorite person. He was wearing a fitted black thermal, work gloves, and an expression of earnest concentration that should not have been attractive. Unfortunately, it was. Lin Mei noticed Evander first. Perfect timing. Cassian offered to drive me to the wholesale market later. No, Evander said immediately. Cassian glanced up, smiled, and set down a crate. Good morning to you too. No, Evander repeated, pointing at him. Whatever this is, no. This, Lin Mei said serenely, is a helpful young man. This is a strategic infiltration. Cassian laughed outright. Evander narrowed his eyes. Don't encourage him. I'm not encouraging him, Lin Mei said. I'm appreciating free labor. Cassian leaned one elbow against a crate and smiled at Evander with shameless amusement. Your mother likes me. My mother likes stray cats, seasonal candles, and emotionally manipulative men in nice coats. Her standards are compromised. Lin Mei gasped. Evander! Cassian looked delighted. Emotionally manipulative? I haven't even started. Evander stared at him. See? Menace. And yet, despite himself, he stayed. That was how the morning turned into disaster. He was cornered into helping sort inventory while Cassian carried crates and chatted with Lin Mei as if he'd been part of their lives for years. He learned, against his will, that Cassian worked at a private sports rehabilitation center in the Upper District, that he had played gravball at university, that he liked terrible reality television, and that he had moved to Vesper City only 3 months ago after taking a promotion. He also learned that Cassian looked offensively domestic, tying ribbons around bouquets under Lin Mei's instructions. At some point, Lin Mei left to answer a supplier call in the back office, leaving Evander alone at the counter scanning invoices, while Cassian stood across from him trimming stems. The silence stretched. Evander did not look up. If you're going to ask something invasive, at least have the courtesy to sound guilty first. Cassian's scissors paused. Do I make you nervous? Evander finally lifted his gaze. Cassian was watching him carefully now, some of the easy playfulness gone. Sunlight poured through the shop windows, catching in his hair and making him look unfairly soft for someone currently threatening Evander's peace of mind. No, Evander said. Cassian smiled faintly. Liar. Evander set the scanner down with deliberate calm. I have no idea what you think you're doing. Neither do I, Cassian admitted. That was not the answer Evander expected. Cassian rested his forearms on the counter, lowering his voice. I know this is insane. We just met. But every time I look at you, it feels like I'm remembering something I can't quite reach. Evander's expression did not change, but his pulse stumbled. Cassian went on quietly. It's been happening for months. These dreams. A mountain in winter. White stone halls. A sword in my hand. Someone standing in the snow wearing black. His eyes searched Evander's face. Then I saw you in this shop and suddenly it felt like I'd been looking for you forever. The room went still. Evander had prepared himself for many possibilities. Mild obsession. Aggressive flirting. Heroic persistence. He had not prepared himself for this open, helpless honesty delivered in the middle of a flower shop while holding a bundle of peonies. Cassian, he said after a moment. Do you usually say things like this to people you met 3 days ago? No. Then perhaps begin reconsidering your choices. Cassian huffed a laugh, but the tension in his shoulders didn't ease. You're not denying it. Evander looked away first. That was answer enough. Cassian inhaled sharply. Before he could speak, May returned carrying a tablet and immediately sensed the charged silence between them. Her gaze flicked from Cassian's expression to Evander's face, and something suspiciously knowing passed through her eyes. Cassian, she said sweetly, would you help me unload the lilies in the back? Cassian blinked. Sure. As he followed her toward the storage room, May paused beside Evander and murmured without looking at him. You're making the poor boy look like someone kicked his favorite puppy. Evander stared at her in disbelief. You are not on my side. I'm on the side of romance and proper hydration. This is not romance. This is harassment. May patted his shoulder and walked away. Traitor. Cassian returned 20 minutes later carrying boxes and a carefully neutral expression. But Evander could feel his attention like heat at the side of his face. It remained there through lunch, through the market run, through the entire miserable afternoon in which Evander failed to escape because his mother kept assigning him tasks. By evening, he was exhausted in the deeply spiritual way only emotional inconvenience could cause. He retreated to his penthouse for the first time in weeks, intending to soak in the tub and avoid human contact until Monday. The penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of a tower overlooking the harbor, all black marble, warm wood, and panoramic windows. The smart glass dimmed automatically as he entered. Ambient lights rose softly along the floor. His home AI asked if he wanted dinner, music, or his weekly financial summary. Silence, Evander said. Understood, the AI replied. He was halfway through undressing when his phone buzzed. Cassian Vale. Evander stared at the name like it was an act of war. Then he opened the message. Cassian. Your mother gave me your number. Before you accuse me of crimes, she said you'd be difficult about it. Evander closed his eyes. A second message appeared. Cassian. Also, I'm sorry if I pushed too hard today. Then, after a pause, Cassian. I just know you're connected to whatever's happening to me. And I don't think it's only happening to me. Evander sat on the edge of the bed, phone in hand, the city glittering beyond the glass. He could ignore it. That would be sensible, clean, safe. Instead, to his own disgust, he typed back. Evander, you are deeply annoying. The reply came almost instantly. Cassian, that's not a no. Evander stared at the screen. Then another message. Cassian, for the record, I make excellent coffee and I'm very good in a crisis. Evander, you are the crisis. There was a long pause. Then, Cassian, that's the nicest thing you've said to me all week. Evander made a strangled sound and threw the phone onto the bed. He should have blocked him. He did not. That night the dreams returned harder than before. Moonlit courtyards. Swordlight flashing silver. The sharp scent of snow and blood. A man in white kneeling beside him with trembling hands, saying his name in a voice so broken it scraped something raw inside Evander's chest. He woke just before dawn, breath shallow, his pulse pounding. For a long time he sat in the dim quiet of the bedroom and stared at the city. He had told himself the past was over. That whatever tragedy had bound him to the righteous hero in another life had died on that mountain. This life was supposed to be different, softer, safer, entirely his own. But Cassian remembered enough to be dangerous. And Evander had already started remembering the exact tone of that voice when it said his name. 3 days later, Fate humiliated him again. He was crossing the lower promenade outside Asterian University after a half-hearted lecture when he spotted Cassian near the fountain, crouched in front of a crying child with a scraped knee. Cassian had somehow acquired a bandage from nowhere and was speaking to the girl with such patient seriousness that she was already sniffling less. Her mother looked exhausted and grateful. Cassian smiled, stuck the glittery patch over the child's knee, and rose just as Evander reached the path. Then he saw him. His entire face lit up. Evander hated that expression on sight. It was too open, too immediate, like seeing Evander had genuinely improved his day. Cassian jogged over. "Hi. You are beginning to feel summoned," Evander said coldly. Cassian laughed, slightly breathless. "This one's not my fault. I had a client nearby." "That's exactly what a stalker would say." "I'm not stalking you. You got my number through my mother. She volunteered it. You accepted it." Cassian looked unrepentant. "Yes." Evander resumed walking. Cassian fell into step beside him with criminal ease. For a while they said nothing. The harbor wind moved through the promenade, carrying the scent of salt and distant rain. Neon reflections shimmered on the water below the transit bridges. Then Cassian said quietly, "I dreamed about you again." Evander's hand tightened around his iced coffee. Cassian kept his gaze ahead. "This time I saw your face." Evander stopped walking. Cassian did too, turning toward him. The sunlight caught in his amber eyes, but there was nothing playful in them now, only something raw and searching. "You were standing on a cliff," Cassian said. "You were bleeding. I was trying to get to you." His voice dropped. "And you looked at me like you'd already decided to leave." Evander's throat tightened. Cassian took one careful step closer. "Who were we?" he asked. The question hit like a blade between the ribs. Evander looked at him, really looked at him, at the confusion and aching certainty in his face, at the impossible familiarity of the soul beneath it, at the way he seemed already halfway wrecked by a history he couldn't fully remember. This was exactly what Evander had feared. Not hatred, not revenge, recognition. He stepped back. Cassian's expression changed instantly. Alarm, hurt, a reflexive panic he tried and failed to hide. "Evander." "I'm going home," Evander said. Then he turned and walked away before his own composure cracked. He expected Cassian to follow. He didn't. That somehow felt worse. By the time Evander returned to the flower shop, his mood was bad enough that even the downstairs tabby abandoned the doorway when it saw him coming. Lin Mei was arranging roses at the counter. She took one look at his face and sighed. "Cassian upset you?" Evander stopped dead. "Why do you say that like it's a routine event?" "Because he came by an hour ago looking tragic and bought sunflowers." Evander stared at her. "He what?" "He looked very handsome about it," Lin Mei added, as though this were relevant. Evander covered his face with one hand. "Why is he coming here to grieve?" "Because he likes you. He has known me for 5 minutes. That has never stopped a determined man." Evander let out a slow breath through his fingers. "I need you to stop helping him." "I'm not helping him," Lin Mei said mildly. "I'm observing. There's a difference." "There really isn't." His phone buzzed. Against his better judgment, he looked. "Cassian, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to push. But if you know what's happening to us, please tell me when you're ready." A second message followed almost immediately. "Cassian, also your mother gave me dumplings and said you get meaner when you're overwhelmed, which feels medically relevant." Evander stared at the screen. Then, despite himself, a short disbelieving laugh escaped him. Of course his emotional crisis had somehow become a cooperative effort between his reincarnated heroic ex and his matchmaking mother. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and looked toward the shop windows, where evening light spilled gold across the street. This was bad. It was so bad. Cassian remembered enough to start asking questions. Evander remembered enough to know exactly how dangerous those answers would be. And worst of all, he was beginning to realize that the man who had once loved him to ruin in another life had found him again in this one. With broad shoulders, stupidly sincere eyes, access to his mother's kitchen, and absolutely no intention of letting him go. Evander Shen had wanted peace. Instead, fate had sent him Cassian Vale. And somehow, impossibly, that was much worse. Part 3. The hero starts remembering and Evander starts suffering. For 3 entire days after the promenade incident, Evander Shen knew peace. It was suspicious. No texts from Cassian. No dramatic flower deliveries to the shop. No broad-shouldered golden menace appearing in his mother's kitchen with coffee and emotional resilience. The silence was so unnatural that by the second day Evander found himself checking his phone in the middle of a lecture, frowning at the lack of messages like a man personally offended by the concept of restraint. By the third day he had reached a deeply humiliating conclusion. Cassian Vale apparently had decided to respect his boundaries. Evander hated it. Not because he wanted Cassian bothering him, obviously. That would be ridiculous and embarrassing and would imply a level of emotional dysfunction Evander preferred to reserve for private reflection at 3 in the morning. No, the problem was that the absence of Cassian had left behind a shape in his routine that Evander had not realized was there until it was empty. The flower shop felt quieter. His mother complained more because she had lost a willing victim to carry inventory. The downstairs tabby had resumed sleeping in Cassian's usual sunspot by the front window, as if claiming abandoned territory. Even the kitchen felt wrong in the mornings without someone humming terribly while making breakfast. It was unbearable. This, Evander announced to the cat on the 4th day, is why I don't form attachments. One persistent idiot appears in your life and suddenly the entire atmosphere gets rearranged. The cat yawned in his face. Evander narrowed his eyes. I'm not attached. I'm irritated by a change in environmental conditions. The cat blinked with the expression of a creature unconvinced by his legal argument. Lin-Mei chose that moment to walk in carrying a fresh tray of wrapped bouquets. Who are you lying to now? No one. You're talking to the cat with your offended voice. I have many voices. Yes, his mother said. Unfortunately. She set the tray on the work table and gave him a long look. You should text Cassian. Evander stared at her in disbelief. Mother, have you considered being normal? I am normal. You're the one sitting in my back room like a widowed aristocrat because your pretty stalker stopped texting. He is not my stalker. Lin-Mei went very still. Evander went still too. The silence thickened. His mother's brows rose slowly. Oh! Evander turned away with the stiff dignity of a man who had made a catastrophic legal admission and now regretted all his life choices. You heard nothing. Lin-Mei smiled with the serenity of a woman who had just won a private war. Of course, dear. Evander escaped upstairs before she could say anything more murderous. He lasted until that evening. At 10:14 p.m., while lying on his penthouse sofa in expensive silence, he opened Cassian's contact and stared at it for a full minute with the intensity of someone contemplating a duel. Then he typed, Evander, did you die? He looked at the message, deleted it, typed again. Evander, has someone finally confiscated your phone? Deleted that too. He glared at the screen, disgusted with himself, and tossed the phone aside. It buzzed 30 seconds later. Evander snatched it back up so quickly he nearly dropped it. Cassian, hi. Evander sat upright. There was no earlier message from him, which meant Cassian had texted first. A second message followed immediately. Cassian, I was trying very hard to be respectful and not bother you. Then, Cassian, this is the worst week of my life. Evander stared at the words. Something traitorous in his chest loosened. He typed before he could stop himself. Evander, that seems dramatic. Cassian, I am dramatic. That, unfortunately, was true. Cassian, also I didn't die. I had to go to Helion District for work. I'm back now. Evander should have left the conversation there. A sensible person would have left the conversation there. Instead, because the universe had decided his second life would be one long exercise in humiliation, he sent, Evander, my mother says the flower shop inventory is suffering without your free labor. The reply came so quickly it was almost insulting. Cassian, your mother misses me? Evander, That is not what I said. Cassian. You texted me first. Sweetheart. I'm counting this as progress. Evander stared at the word sweetheart until his face went hot with outrage. Evander. You are one message away from getting blocked. Cassian. Then I'll save the really affectionate ones for in person. Evander threw the phone onto the opposite couch and informed the ceiling that if reincarnation existed solely to punish him, he would like to file a formal complaint. The next morning, Cassian appeared at the flower shop with coffee. Not one coffee. 3. One for villainmc, one for himself, and one made exactly the way Evander liked it despite the fact that Evander had never told him his order. Evander stood at the counter and looked from the cup to Cassian with growing suspicion. Cassian, bright-eyed and criminally handsome in a dark bomber jacket, smiled innocently. Morning. How do you know my coffee order? Cassian held out the cup. Your mother told me. villainmc, traitor that she was, didn't even look ashamed. He asked nicely. I live in a nest of enemies, Evander muttered. Cassian looked delighted by the phrase. Nest of enemies sounds intimate. Everything sounds intimate to you. That's because I'm in love with your personality. Evander stared at him. We have known each other for less than 2 weeks. Cassian took a calm sip of coffee. And yet, villainmc made a strangled noise into her cup that was definitely laughter. Evander contemplated walking into traffic. Unfortunately, the day only got worse. He had agreed, under emotional duress and maternal manipulation, to help his mother deliver a custom floral installation to a corporate charity gala that evening. The event was being held at the Oraline Spire, one of the oldest luxury towers in Vesper's central district, where executives with too much money and not enough shame gathered to auction art and pretend to care about philanthropy. Normally Evander would have sent staff. Normally he would have faked illness. Normally he would have done anything possible to avoid spending a night in formal wear around rich people who might know his family name. But villainmc had looked at him with that soft, dangerous smile mothers developed when they knew exactly how to exploit filial guilt. And now here he was standing in his penthouse dressing room while a tailor's assistant adjusted the fall of his black suit. The suit was custom, of course. Midnight black with a high collar, sharp shoulders, and subtle silver threading at the cuffs that caught light like starlines. It fit him obscenely well, which was irritating because Evander had no desire to look this expensive in public. He was fastening the cuff when his comm chimed. Cassian, what are you doing tonight? Evander hesitated. Evander, being extorted by my mother. There was a pause. Cassian, that could mean anything with your family. Evander frowned at the screen. Evander, how do you know anything about my family? 3 dots appeared, vanished, reappeared. Cassian, because I looked you up after meeting you. Evander closed his eyes. Of course he had. In Vesper City, the Shen name still opened doors. Not because villainmc's flower shop was famous, but because Evander's late father had come from one of the old financial dynasties that had helped build half the upper district. Evander had inherited trust assets, voting shares in several tech firms, and enough property holdings to make gossip feeds describe him as reclusive old money nobility with a trust fund and a bad attitude. He disliked all of it. The money was useful. The attention was not. Cassian, in my defense, I found out you're rich by accident and then got distracted by a 10-year-old article calling you the Frost Prince of the Shen estate. Evander went still. Evander, what article? Cassian, the one with the photos of you at a winter charity ball looking like you'd poison everyone in the room for fun. Evander stared at the message with profound offense. Cassian, you were 16. It was adorable. Evander, I'm blocking you. Cassian, you say that a lot for someone who never does it. He hated how true that was. By the time Evander arrived at Oraline Spire with his mother, he was already in a mood. The gala occupied 3 floors of the tower's sky atrium, a soaring chamber of suspended crystal gardens and holographic constellations drifting beneath a glass dome. The city spread beyond the walls in rivers of light. Servers moved through the crowd carrying champagne and engineered desserts too pretty to eat. Music floated from a live quartet stationed on a raised platform of illuminated glass. Evander should have expected half the city to be there. He should also have expected to walk in and find Cassian. He did not expect both at once. Cassian was standing near the central fountain in a dark tailored suit that made him look less like a sports therapist and more like the kind of man old families arranged marriages around. His hair was brushed back from his forehead. Gold glinted at his wrist. He was laughing at something a silver-haired woman beside him had said. Then he looked up. His entire expression changed. The laughter vanished. The ease vanished. For one bare second Cassian simply stared, and the force of that stare landed on Evander like a hand to the chest. Then Cassian crossed the room. He didn't weave through the crowd so much as move through it with absurd directness. All 6 feet of him focused entirely on Evander. "Wow," he said when he reached him. Evander, who had spent the last 5 minutes enduring greetings from men old enough to be his grandfather, was in no mood for sincerity. "What?" Cassian looked him over once, not leering, not smug, just openly struck dumb by the sight of him. "You look incredible." Evander blinked. Cassian exhaled, hand going to his chest like he'd been physically wounded. "That sounded calmer in my head. What I meant was, if you leave tonight without letting me stare respectfully for at least 10 more minutes, I'll take it as an act of personal cruelty." Evander felt heat rise to his face and hated every molecule of it. "Why are you here?" he asked coldly. "My center's a sponsor for the gala." Cassian smiled, then lowered his voice. "Also, your mother told me you'd be here." Evander closed his eyes briefly. "I need you both to stop forming alliances." "No," Lin-mei said from beside him, entirely too cheerful. "You don't." Cassian looked over at her with shameless gratitude. "You understand me." "I understand romance," Lin-mei corrected. "This is not romance," Evander muttered. Neither of them paid attention. That should have been the worst part of the evening. It wasn't. The worst part began 40 minutes later when Evander, trapped in conversation with 2 biotech investors and a woman who kept asking whether he planned to re-enter society, now that he was older, felt a sudden sharp wave of dizziness hit behind his eyes. He stiffened. Then came the second wave. Heat bloomed under his skin. Fast, unnatural, wrong. His stomach dropped. No, absolutely not. Evander had presented late, at 19, in a medical mess his doctors had called atypical but manageable. In practical terms, it meant his secondary gender biology ran strangely quiet most of the time, suppressed enough that people often forgot it existed at all. He took low-dose stabilizers, kept emergency scent blockers in every residence he owned, and had spent years building his life around the very simple principle of never causing a scene. Tonight, his body had apparently decided to betray him in formal wear. The room's lights sharpened. Sound turned too loud. The synthetic floral perfume in the air became overwhelming. Beneath it all came the first warning edge of his own scent escaping suppression. Cool cedar, winter citrus, and the metallic sweetness that always appeared when his hormones spiked. Panic flashed cold and vicious through him. He needed suppressant. Now, Evander set down his champagne untouched and turned for the nearest corridor, keeping his face blank through sheer force of aristocratic training. He had made it halfway to the private washrooms when someone caught his wrist. Every nerve in his body lit with alarm. He turned sharply. Cassian. Of course it was Cassian. He was no longer smiling. Up close his expression was tense, focused, wrong in a way that made Evander's pulse stutter. "Evander," Cassian said quietly. "What's wrong?" "Nothing." "Liar." Evander tried to pull his hand back. Cassian's grip tightened. Not enough to hurt, just enough to stop him from leaving. "Let go." Cassian leaned closer, inhaled, and went very still. The change in his face was immediate and catastrophic. His pupils blew wide. His shoulders locked. Evander felt the exact moment Cassian caught the shift in his scent. "Oh hell." Cassian's voice dropped to something rougher. "You're in pre-rut." Evander stared at him in outrage. "Could you say that any louder? Perhaps with a microphone." Cassian ignored the glare. "Do you have suppressant?" "Yes." "On you?" "No." Cassian swore under his breath. That alone was enough to tell Evander how serious the situation looked from the outside. Cassian was usually absurdly polite when Lin Mei wasn't around. Hearing him curse made a thin line of unease run down Evander's spine. The crowd was only a corridor away. If his sense spiked properly in a room full of upper district alphas and sense-sensitive omegas, he would never recover from the humiliation. "I'm fine," Evander said through his teeth. Cassian looked at him with naked disbelief. "You're shaking." Evander looked down. His hand was, in fact, trembling. This was appalling. Cassian's jaw tightened. "Come with me. I'd rather die." "You're being dramatic. I learned from the best." Cassian did not smile. Instead, he stepped closer and lowered his voice until it was barely more than breath. "Evander, I have a private suite upstairs because the center rented one for overnight guests. It has medical supplies, scent dampeners, and privacy. If you keep standing here pretending you're fine, I'm going to pick you up and carry you there in front of everyone." Evander stared at him. Cassian stared back with the calm certainty of a man fully prepared to commit social atrocities. The horrifying part was that Evander believed him. "You wouldn't dare," he hissed. Cassian's eyes flicked once over his face, over the tremor in his hand, over the heat he was trying and failing to hide. Something in Cassian's expression softened into fierce, impossible tenderness. "Try me," he said. Evander hated that his body made the decision before his pride could. Another pulse of dizziness hit, hard enough that his knees weakened for half a second. Cassian caught his elbow instantly. "Don't," Evander snapped. "I'm literally helping you stand." "I dislike the implication." Cassian exhaled through his nose, then steered him toward the private lift corridor with one hand at his back. No one stopped them. Evander didn't know whether to be grateful or offended. The suite upstairs was dark, quiet, and mercifully empty. The moment the door sealed behind them, Evander shoved Cassian's hand away and crossed the room on shaky legs, trying to gather enough dignity to survive this. He made it as far as the marble kitchen island before bracing both palms against it and breathing hard through another wave of heat. Cassian was already moving, locking the suite's privacy settings, dimming the lights, checking a wall cabinet with clinical speed. "Medical kit," he muttered. "Dampener patches, painkillers, basic suppressants." There. He brought over a sealed injector and set it in front of Evander. Evander reached for it with unsteady fingers. Cassian caught his wrist. "Wait." His gaze sharpened. "How much have you already taken this week?" Evander looked away. Cassian's expression darkened. "Evander. Once. Try again." Evander said nothing. Cassian's mouth fell open in disbelief. "You've been overusing them. They're my meds. I can use them as I please. You can also poison your endocrine system as you please, apparently." Evander glared at him. "I invited you up here to help, not to become my doctor. You didn't invite me anywhere. I blackmailed you with public embarrassment. That is not the point." "It is a little the point." Despite the heat crawling under his skin and the deepening pressure in his bones, Evander almost laughed. The absurdity of this, of being cornered in a luxury suite by his reincarnated ex while arguing about hormone suppressants, was so offensively specific it bordered on performance art. Cassian's expression shifted when he saw the laugh trying to break through. Softened, just a little. "Hey!" he said quietly. Evander looked up. Cassian stepped closer, slower this time, as if approaching a startled animal. "I'm not trying to control you. I just need to know how bad this is." Evander swallowed. Too close. Cassian was standing too close, smelling like clean soap and warm skin and the faint spice of his own alpha scent pressing insistently at the edges of control. Not aggressive, not overwhelming, just there, broad and steady and impossible to ignore. "It's manageable," Evander said after a moment. Usually, Cassian repeated. "And tonight." Evander looked away again. "Tonight is inconvenient." Cassian made a low sound that was almost a laugh and almost not. "You're having a hormone crash in a gala tower, and your concern is the inconvenience. My priorities are excellent. Your priorities are terrifying." Cassian took the injector, checked the dosage, then held it out again. "Sit down." Evander considered refusing on principle. Then another wave hit and his body chose mutiny over pride. He sat. Cassian knelt in front of him to inject the suppressant into his forearm, and Evander, already overheated and half-dizzy, nearly short-circuited on the spot. This was not a reasonable position for a man who looked like that. Cassian's head was bent in concentration, long fingers careful against Evander's skin, his touch firm but gentle as he pressed the injector to the inside of Evander's arm. He smelled warm. He looked unfairly good at eye level. And he was kneeling between Evander's knees like it was the most natural thing in the world. Evander looked at the ceiling and thought, with exhausted clarity, "I died once and apparently that wasn't enough." The injector hissed softly. Cassian set it aside and kept hold of Evander's wrist for another few seconds, tracking his pulse. "It should start easing in a minute," he said. Evander's voice came out drier than intended. "You seem alarmingly practiced." Cassian glanced up. "Sports medicine. Hormone injuries aren't uncommon in contact leagues." "That's reassuring in a deeply unromantic way." Cassian smiled faintly. "You think this is romantic?" Evander made the mistake of looking at him. Cassian was still kneeling there, one hand around Evander's wrist, the other braced lightly against his knee. His expression had gone softer again. Fond, intent, dangerous in a way Evander recognized too well from another lifetime. Then Cassian said, very quietly, "Everything with you feels romantic." The room went silent. Evander forgot how to breathe. Cassian seemed to realize what he'd said only after it was already hanging in the air between them. His ears went pink. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then, because apparently humiliation was contagious, added helplessly, "I know that was terrible timing." Evander stared at him. "Yes," he said at last. "That was catastrophically timed." Cassian laughed under his breath. The sound frayed around the edges. "Sorry." The suppressant finally began to work, taking the sharpest edge off the heat. Not enough to make Evander comfortable, but enough that the world stopped tilting. Cassian noticed the shift immediately. Better. Marginally less doomed. "I'll take it." He stood, moved to the suite's mini kitchen, and returned with water and a cooling patch for the back of Evander's neck. The patch was humiliatingly effective. Evander hated that too. By the time Lin-Mei called 20 minutes later asking where on earth he'd vanished to, Evander was no longer in danger of collapsing in public. He was, however, trapped in a private suite with Cassian Vale, who had seen him at one of his most vulnerable moments and had somehow become even more insufferably tender afterward. This was a disaster. Worse, Evander had a sinking suspicion it was only the beginning. Part 4. A gala, a rut suppressant, and one very public disaster. By the time Evander was stable enough to return downstairs, he had made 3 decisions. First, he was never attending a gala again. Second, he was firing whichever physician had assured him his stabilizer dosage was perfectly adequate. Third, if Cassian Vale so much as looked at him with that unbearably soft expression one more time, Evander was going to push him off the nearest balcony. Unfortunately, none of those decisions improved his situation. Cassian insisted on walking him back to the atrium to make sure you don't pass out elegantly beside a dessert table, which was offensive on multiple levels, not least because it implied Evander would pass out inelegantly under any circumstances. "I'm fine," Evander said as the lift doors opened. "You're glaring at the floor hard enough to crack tile. I can multitask. You're swaying. I am not." Cassian caught his elbow before he walked directly into a mirrored pillar. Evander stopped, looked at the pillar, looked at Cassian's hand on his arm. Then, with all the dignity of a dethroned monarch, said, "The architecture moved." Cassian bit his lip so hard it was almost impressive. "Of course it did. Don't start." "I'm not starting anything. You're making that face." "What face?" "The one where you think I'm charming." Cassian's expression went utterly sincere. "I always think you're charming." Evander stared at him for one beat, then resumed walking before murder became socially unavoidable. The atrium was even more crowded now. The charity auction had ended and the floor had shifted into that dangerous phase of rich people events where everyone was slightly drunk, emotionally overconfident, and eager to socialize in ways that should have been punishable by law. Lin Mei was standing near the floral display speaking to an older Omega in a silver suit when she spotted them. Her eyes immediately dropped to Cassian's hand still hovering at Evander's back. Then to Evander's face. Then back to Cassian. Her expression brightened with the terrifying force of maternal speculation. Evander saw it happen in real time and felt his soul leave his body. "No," he said flatly as they approached. Lin Mei blinked innocently. "No what?" "No whatever narrative you've just invented." "I haven't invented anything," she said. "Cassian, dear. Thank you for taking care of my son." Cassian, trader, looked modest about it. "He'd probably prefer if I pretended none of it happened." "He would," Evander said. Lin Mei patted his sleeve. "Unfortunately for you, I'm too curious." "Mother, was it stress?" she asked him in a lower voice. "Or one of your episodes?" Cassian's head snapped toward her. Evander closed his eyes. There were many forms of suffering in the universe. This one, being lovingly exposed by your mother in front of the man haunting your reincarnation, ranked high on the list. "It's handled," Evander said tightly. Lin Mei's expression softened at once. "All right." She reached up and smoothed his hair back from his forehead with absent tenderness. "You still look pale. I'm wearing black in bad lighting. You inherited your father's ability to lie with a straight face and I resent it." Cassian made a very quiet sound that suggested he was filing episodes away for later. Evander wanted to fake his own death. He might have succeeded in escaping the rest of the evening if not for Shen. Evander saw his cousin before Orson saw him, which meant he had exactly 3 seconds to experience despair before the inevitable collision occurred. Shen was 30, technically family, and proof that money did not improve a person's character. He was the son of Evander's late father's older brother, a smug finance darling who wore his pedigree like a weapon and had spent most of Evander's childhood treating him as a decorative inconvenience. Their relationship had improved only in the sense that adulthood had given Evander enough authority over his own trust holdings to ignore him more effectively. Tonight Orson was in a pale gray suit, champagne in hand, with the expression of a man who had spotted entertainment. "Well," Orson drawled as he approached. "There you are. I was beginning to think you'd fled before anyone could confirm you still exist." Evander looked at him with practiced boredom. "Tragic. You must have been devastated." Orson's gaze flicked over him, then to Lin Mei, then to Cassian at Evander's side. His smile sharpened. "Aunt May, you look lovely. And this is Cassian Vale," Cassian said easily, offering a hand. Orson shook it with the air of a man cataloging useful details. "Friend of the family?" "Unfortunately," Evander muttered. Cassian's mouth twitched. Lin Mei, who should have been helping and was not, smiled serenely. "He's been very kind to Evander." Orson looked between them with immediate interest. "Has he?" Evander could actually feel the oncoming headache. Orson was the sort of man who treated every social interaction as a marketplace. If he smelled vulnerability, he prodded it. If he sensed gossip, he sharpened it. He had no moral objection to making scenes so long as he remained technically polite while doing it. "Still hiding from the board, Evander?" Orson asked lightly. "Grandfather's been asking whether you plan to attend a single trust meeting this quarter or continue your lifelong commitment to decorative unemployment." Cassian's posture changed. Only slightly, a minute straightening of the spine, a stillness settling under the easy warmth. But Evander saw it, and the sight sent a strange electric awareness through him. Hero. Not the modern himbo in expensive tailoring. Not the teasing man who texted him nonsense and made pancakes in his mother's kitchen. For one breath, Evander glimpsed the other shape beneath it. The man who had once stood between him and an army with a sword in his hand and murder in his eyes. Evander recovered first. "Tell grandfather I remain committed to disappointing everyone," he said coolly. "It's one of my more enduring talents." Orson laughed. "You joke. But the trustees are getting restless. There's a proposal next month regarding the Helix bioshares. If you don't show up, people might assume you're too unstable to manage your own voting rights. Lin Mei's face hardened instantly. Orson. What? He said with false innocence. I'm only passing along concern. Cassian set his glass down. The sound was soft. Too soft. Concern, he repeated. Orson looked at him. Something funny? Cassian smiled. It was a lovely smile. Bright, polite, completely non-threatening, which made the violence of the energy beneath it even more alarming. No, Cassian said pleasantly. I was just thinking that if someone spoke about my family that way in public, I'd have enough self-preservation not to stand within arm's reach afterward. The air around them went very still. Orson's brows rose. Excuse me? Evander, who had not expected this evening to improve, felt a dangerous spark of delight. Cassian folded his hands behind his back like a man discussing weather patterns. You heard me, Cassian, Evander murmured, because while he was enjoying this, he was not convinced public homicide would be good for anyone's reputation. Cassian ignored him. Orson gave a short laugh. You don't know anything about our family. No, Cassian agreed. But I know what it looks like when someone mistakes cruelty for wit. Lin Mei took a very calm sip of champagne and said absolutely nothing, which was how Evander knew she was having the time of her life. Orson's smile thinned. Careful. You're speaking to a Shin. Cassian's own smile sharpened at the edges. So am I. Evander stared. For one bizarre second, Orson looked as thrown as Evander felt. Then Orson's gaze slid to Evander and understanding flickered there. Understanding not of the reincarnation disaster, obviously, but of something far more immediate and socially catastrophic. Ah, Orson said softly. I see. Evander did not like that tone. Not one bit. Orson smiled the way sharks probably did. Well, that explains the protective instincts. Orson, Evander said. And this time there was enough ice in his voice to frost glass. But Orson had already decided to be entertaining. You should have said you'd found yourself a guard dog, cousin. His gaze flicked deliberately over Cassian, then back to Evander. Though I admit I'm surprised by your taste. He seems a little earnest for you. Cassian's jaw flexed. Evander's patience, already threadbare, snapped. Oh, don't be bitter, he said coolly. If I wanted a man who looked permanently constipated in expensive wool, I'd have chosen from within the family. Lin Mei choked on her champagne. Cassian made a startled noise that might have been a laugh. Orson's face went blank. For one glorious second, silence rang through the entire little circle around them. Then Orson said, very softly, You really should learn when to stop. Evander smiled at him with all the warmth of a sharpened blade. And you should learn that threatening me in public has never gone well for anyone. Orson looked at him for a long moment. Then his gaze slid to Cassian again, contempt and calculation mingling in a way Evander recognized too well. This isn't over, Orson said. Cassian stepped half a pace forward. Evander caught his wrist before he could. It was an instinctive movement, thoughtless, familiar in a way that made both of them freeze. Cassian looked down at Evander's hand around his wrist, then up at Evander's face. The noise of the gala receded. For a heartbeat Evander saw it happen, saw memory strike. Cassian went completely still. Not socially still. Not politely controlled. The other kind. The dangerous kind. The kind that used to descend right before a battlefield changed shape. His pupils widened. His breath caught. Then he whispered, hoarse and disbelieving, You did that before. Evander's fingers loosened at once. Cassian caught his hand before he could pull away. The touch was gentle, reverent almost, like he was holding something he had lost once and could not believe he'd found again. You grabbed my wrist exactly like that, Cassian said, staring at him. On the cliff. Evander's heart slammed against his ribs. Orson, forgotten for the moment, looked between them like he'd stumbled into a conversation without subtitles. Cassian's grip tightened slightly. You said. He broke off, eyes unfocusing for a second as if something was splitting open behind them. You said if I followed you, you'd hate me for the rest of my life. Evander stopped breathing. He had said that, not on a cliff but near one, on the mountain path hours before his death, when Cassian, another Cassian, sword-bright and furious and desperate, had tried to stop him from walking toward a trap he'd already chosen to spring. If you follow me now, I'll hate you for the rest of my life. A lie, of course, but one cruel enough to make the hero hesitate. Long enough for Evander to go alone. Cassian's face had gone white. He was remembering, not a dream, not fragments, not instincts without shape. Remembering. Cassian, Evander said quietly. Cassian looked at him as if the world had narrowed to a single point and Evander was standing at the center of it. Why would you say that? He whispered. The question was too raw, too immediate, too close to the wound Evander had spent 2 lifetimes refusing to touch. Not here, Evander said. Cassian swallowed hard. Then where? Before Evander could answer, the room lights shifted. A soft chime rang through the atrium as the next phase of the gala began. The benefactor announcement, followed by the ceremonial dance that old money donors adored because it gave them an excuse to parade their heirs in designer formalwear. Evander nearly laughed from sheer disbelief. Of course fate would schedule an emotional crisis around a public social ritual. A host stepped onto the illuminated stage and began welcoming everyone back. Around the atrium, guests drifted toward the dance floor. Lin-Mei, who had absolutely not missed a single second of what just happened, looked from Cassian's face to Evander's and then, with the mercilessness of a woman who believed in romance more than personal dignity, said, "You two should dance." Evander turned to her slowly. "Mother, what? You're both already suffering. You may as well suffer beautifully." Cassian, who was still staring at Evander like a man recovering from a lightning strike, somehow managed to speak. "I don't think now is." "Yes," Lin-Mei said firmly. "Now is exactly when." Orson made a disbelieving sound and walked away before the Shen family could embarrass him by association. Coward. Evander looked back at Cassian and found him still pale, still shaken, still holding Evander's hand. There were too many people watching, too many questions in Cassian's face, too many memories pressing against the inside of Evander's skull. And perhaps that was exactly why he said it. "Fine," Evander muttered. Cassian blinked. "Fine. One dance," Evander said. "If you continue looking at me like a haunted cathedral painting, I'll regret it immediately." Cassian stared at him for another second, then let out a breath that sounded suspiciously like relief. "Okay," he said softly. The dance floor glowed beneath suspended lights as they stepped onto it. Around them, couples arranged themselves into neat social geometry, silk and jewels and old money moving under the atrium's artificial stars. Cassian placed one hand carefully at Evander's waist. Evander set his own hand on Cassian's shoulder. Then Cassian took his other hand, and the moment their fingers laced, memory hit. Not just for Cassian, for Evander too. A courtyard washed in moonlight, white sleeves, the rasp of breath after sparring. Cassian, his first Cassian, laughing softly as Evander stepped on his robes during a festival dance because he'd never bothered learning the proper footwork. "You're terrible at this," the hero had murmured. "And yet you keep asking me, because you always say yes in the end." The memory vanished so fast it almost hurt. Evander stumbled. Cassian's arm tightened around his waist instantly. "Evander, I'm fine." "Liar. Stop saying that. You keep making it true." His hand at Evander's waist was warm, steady, protective in a way that should not have made Evander's chest ache. Around them, the gala blurred into light and music and distant conversation. For one impossible stretch of time, it felt as though they had stepped sideways out of the modern world and into some quieter place made only of orbiting memory. Cassian looked down at him, eyes dark with too much feeling. "I loved you," he said under the music. Evander's breath caught. Cassian swallowed. "I don't remember everything yet, but I know that much." "Cassian, I loved you," he repeated, more fiercely this time, as if saying it aloud made it real in his own mind. And whatever happened at the end, whatever you did or whatever you think you did, I don't care. Evander stared at him. Cassian's voice dropped to something that belonged to another life entirely. I found you again. That's the only part one care about. The music continued around them, elegant and oblivious. Evander could not speak, because this was exactly the problem. Cassian was remembering the love first, not the betrayal, not the blood, not the mountain, not the body at the bottom of the cliff and the truth Evander had buried with it. Just the love. And if he kept digging, the rest would come too. The song ended. Applause scattered through the atrium as couples drifted apart, smiling and bowing and resuming the glittering theater of Upper District life. Evander stepped back at once. Cassian let him go, but only barely. His hand lingered against Evander's fingers as if reluctant to break contact. We need to talk, Cassian said. Evander looked at him for a long moment. Then, because there was no point pretending this could be avoided any longer, he said, tomorrow. Cassian's expression sharpened with immediate hope. Tomorrow. At my penthouse, Evander said. 8 o'clock. If you're late, I'll lock you out. Cassian looked so absurdly pleased by this that Evander immediately regretted everything. Okay, Cassian said. And there was that awful warmth in his face again. That soft, impossible happiness, as if Evander had handed him the world instead of a scheduled emotional breakdown. I'll be there. Lin-mei appeared at Evander's elbow the moment Cassian stepped away to answer a call from one of the gala sponsors. She watched Cassian go with naked approval. Then she looked at Evander. Well, she said. Evander rubbed at his temple. If you say a single matchmaking sentence, I'll move to another planet. Lin-mei smiled. You could. He'd follow you. Evander said nothing, which was answer enough. His mother's expression gentled. Be careful tomorrow, she said quietly. Not because of him. Because of you. Evander looked at her. Lin-mei touched his cheek with the backs of her fingers, tender and knowing in that infuriating maternal way of hers. You've looked lonely since the day you were old enough to hide it, she said. I don't know what history is sitting between you two, and I won't push if you don't want me to. But I do know that boy looks at you like he's been starving. Evander's throat tightened. Mother. I know, she said softly. You're fine. Everything's fine. You're very dramatic and very rich and tragically burdened by beautiful men. I understand. Despite himself, Evander laughed. Lin-mei smiled, victorious. By the time the gala finally ended, the suppressant had fully stabilized his system and Orson had vanished into the crowd like the unpleasant spirit he was. Cassian walked them to the tower entrance, made sure Lin-mei's car arrived safely, and only then looked at Evander. Tomorrow sat between them like a live wire. Cassian's voice was low. Will you actually tell me the truth? Evander held his gaze. The harbor wind lifted the edges of Cassian's coat. Beyond him, Vesper City burned in ribbons of neon and glass. No, Evander said honestly. But I might tell you enough to ruin both our lives. Cassian's mouth curved. Not because the answer was reassuring. Because it was Evander, and apparently that alone was enough. Good, he said. I'll come anyway. Of course he would. Evander slid into the car beside his mother and watched Cassian grow smaller through the tinted glass as the city lights swallowed him. Tomorrow he was going to tell Cassian something. Not everything. Never everything. But enough. Enough to explain why the villain of the old world had died smiling. Enough to explain why the righteous hero should have let him fall. Enough to make Cassian understand that loving Evander Shen had never ended well for anyone. And somewhere deep in his bones, where memory still lived like an old wound, Evander already knew the problem. Cassian would hear every warning. Then he would love him anyway, which, frankly, was the most terrifying part of all. Part 5: The Truth Evander Buried. The next evening, Vesper City was drowning in rain. Sheets of silver struck the penthouse windows hard enough to blur the skyline into smeared neon and ghost light, the towers beyond the harbor dissolving into color and shadow. The storm made the whole world feel enclosed, as if the city had been sealed inside glass and thunder. Evander stood barefoot in his kitchen with one hand braced against the marble island and stared at the clock projected discreetly onto the wall. 7:56. He had changed clothes 3 times. The first outfit had looked too formal, which suggested he cared. The second had looked too casual, which somehow also suggested he cared. The third, soft black lounge trousers and a dark knit with the sleeves pushed to his forearms, was as close to emotional neutrality as he was going to get without greeting Cassian wrapped in a bedsheet like a resentful ghost. He had also made tea he did not intend to drink, rearranged the living room twice, and spent 15 uninterrupted minutes standing in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows thinking, with mounting irritation, that if he had simply jumped from a different cliff in his last life, perhaps fate would have had the decency to lose his paperwork. At 7:58, his home AI said, in its calm, neutral voice, "Visitor approaching. Identity confirmed. Cassian Vale." Evander closed his eyes. Of course he was early. Naturally, the man who treated emotional catastrophe like a scheduled dental cleaning had arrived 2 minutes before the appointed time. As if punctuality could somehow soften the fact that Evander was about to dismantle both of their lives in his sitting room. "Let him up," Evander muttered. "Access granted." He heard the private lift engage. A second later, he heard himself say, to absolutely no one, "I hate this." Then the lift doors opened. Cassian stepped into the penthouse carrying takeout. Evander stared. Cassian, damp from the rain and unfairly good-looking in a charcoal coat over a fitted black shirt, lifted the bag slightly, as if this were a normal social call and not a confrontation with reincarnated tragedy. "You skipped dinner at the gala after your suppressant crash," he said. "And your mother told me you forget to eat when you're stressed." Evander put a hand over his face. "Why?" he asked through his fingers. "Do you and my mother keep exchanging intelligence like allied governments?" Cassian's mouth twitched. "I brought dumplings as a peace offering. This is not a peace negotiation." "I know." He stepped farther inside, gaze resting on Evander's face with that now familiar intensity, the warmth in it tempered by nerves and something heavier underneath. "I still brought dumplings." The ridiculous thing was that Evander's first coherent thought was they smell good. His second coherent thought was this is exactly how hostile takeovers happen. He exhaled through his nose and gestured toward the kitchen. "Put them down before I accuse you of emotional manipulation again." Cassian's expression brightened, absurdly, as if being allowed into Evander's kitchen counted as a major romantic milestone. Probably did, which was mortifying. He set the bag on the island and began unpacking containers with the ease of someone who had no respect for the sacred boundaries of another man's home. Soup dumplings, chili noodles, steamed buns. 2 desserts Evander had once made the mistake of mentioning in front of his mother. Evander looked at the spread and then at him. "You brought enough food to sedate a small army." Cassian shrugged. "I panic cater. That is not a real phrase." "It is now." Rain battered the windows. The penthouse lights were low, warm against the storm-dark glass, and for a brief irrational second the scene looked so domestic it made something in Evander recoil. Cassian in his kitchen, food on the counter, thunder overhead, the city glowing beyond them. It looked too much like the kind of life Evander had never let himself imagine in either lifetime. He turned away first. "Sit," he said. "Eat. Then I'll ruin your evening." Cassian leaned against the island instead of sitting. "I'm already here. You can start whenever." Evander poured tea because it gave his hands something to do. The silence stretched. The only sounds were rain, distant thunder, and the soft clink of porcelain. When he finally spoke, he did not look at Cassian. "In my last life," he said quietly, "my name wasn't Evander Shen." Cassian went still. Evander set a cup down. "I was born into the Yun sect under the name Shen Wei. My mother died when I was too young to remember her properly. My father was a sect elder, brilliant, ambitious, and permanently disappointed that his son preferred books and poisons to righteous sword forms. His mouth curved without humor. I was not the kind of child cultivation sects admire. I was clever in unpleasant ways, petty, prideful, bad at obedience, very good at making enemies." Cassian did not interrupt. He simply watched, the takeout forgotten. Evander moved to the windows, tea in hand, and looked out at the storm. The cultivation world remembers me as a villain because that was what I became in the end. But I wasn't born monstrous. No one ever is. Most of us just make the mistake of surviving in the wrong direction. The city flashed white with lightning. I met you when I was 17, he continued. You were the golden disciple of the Lin sect then. Cassian in another body, another face, another life, but still you. Everyone adored you. You were talented, righteous, impossible to intimidate, and so offensively sincere that I spent our first meeting deciding whether I wanted to stab you or throw you into a pond. Cassian huffed out a startled laugh. That sounds right. I tried to hate you, Evander said. It would have been much easier if I had succeeded. He remembered it too clearly now. The training grounds dusted with snow, the white-robed disciple who had smiled at him as if Shen Wei's sarcasm were a private joke rather than a warning. The way Cassian had looked at him even then. Not with fear, not with suspicion, but with impossible, infuriating curiosity. As if he had seen something worth keeping in the sharp-mouthed son of a sect elder who never fit anywhere cleanly. You were persistent, Evander said, and annoying, and kind in ways I didn't know how to survive. You kept finding me in libraries, on rooftops, in medicine halls. You brought me tea when I studied too late. You argued with me about doctrine. You kept trying to drag me into sunlight and social events and the deeply horrifying experience of having friends. Cassian's expression softened. Did it work? Evander looked at him over the rim of his cup. Regrettably, for a moment the tension eased. Then Evander set the cup aside and the warmth left his face. The problem was never us, he said. The problem was everything around us. He told Cassian about the first fracture. His father's death, publicly blamed on rogue cultivators and privately wrapped in lies so obvious even Shen Wei, half mad with grief, could see through them. He told him about the evidence that pointed not outward but inward, to sect elders selling spirit or routes, to forbidden experiments hidden beneath monastery vaults, to children with rare constitutions being quietly taken from lesser branch families and used in cultivation trials no one was supposed to survive. Cassian's expression changed as the story darkened. His hands, folded on the marble, tightened by slow degrees. Evander kept going. Among those children was my younger half-brother, he said. No one knew he existed except my father and a handful of servants. He'd hidden the boy away in a remote estate because his constitution made him valuable to the wrong people. When my father died, the estate's protections collapsed. By the time I found out, the sect had already taken him. Cassian inhaled sharply. Evander's gaze remained fixed on the rain. He was 13. The words sat between them like a wound. I went to the elders first, Evander said. I still believed at that point that there had been some mistake, that if I brought proof, someone righteous would stop it. I brought names, documents, testimony. Do you know what they told me? Cassian's voice was rough. What? That sacrifices were sometimes necessary for the greater balance. Evander laughed once, low and terrible. I was 17 and stupid enough to think there were limits to what powerful men would justify if they called it duty. He could still remember the room. Incense, polished wood, old men in ceremonial robes speaking of necessity, while a child screamed somewhere beneath the mountain. I tried to tell you, Evander said. Cassian's head lifted sharply. Me? You were the only person I trusted enough to ruin, Evander said, and watched the words hit him. I brought you evidence. Not all of it, never enough to implicate my brother, but enough to show corruption in 3 sections. You believed me. Of course you did. You always believed me first and asked practical questions second. A memory surfaced so vividly it stole his breath for a second. A moonlit courtyard, papers spread between them. Cassian's face gone cold with fury as he read. Tell me who I need to kill, the hero had said quietly. Evander had laughed then, because even righteous men became terrifying when someone they loved was cornered. I thought we could expose them, Evander said. Bring the sects down cleanly. Force a trial. Force accountability. But one of your senior brothers found out. He was part of it too. Cassian's face had gone white. Wait, he said. Rian. Evander's eyes flicked to him. And there it was, the first full memory breach. Not just a sensation. A name. Rian Chiu, Evander confirmed softly. Your sect brother. The one you trusted enough to call family. He'd been helping broker spirit routes for years. He sold information. He sold artifacts. Eventually he sold children. Cassian staggered back a step as if struck. No, he said, but there was no conviction in it. Only horror and the dawning shape of memory. No, You remember him, Evander said. Cassian put a hand over his mouth. He remembered. Evander saw it in real time. The collapse of certainty. The way grief and disbelief tore across his expression as fragments clicked into place. Rian laughing over shared wine. Rian standing at Cassian's shoulder in white robes. Rian kneeling at a trial months later, solemn and righteous, swearing that Shinwei had forged evidence and fallen into demonic cultivation out of jealousy and ambition. Cassian sank down onto one of the kitchen stools like his knees had stopped working. Evander almost stopped then. Almost. But there was no point in mercy now. Not with the truth this close to daylight. Rian warned the elders that I knew too much, Evander said. They moved my brother before I could reach him. Burned the estate where he'd been kept. Killed the servants. Then they accused me of experimenting with forbidden methods and murdering my own father for inheritance. Cassian looked up, eyes glass-bright with disbelief. You didn't tell me. I tried. Evander's voice remained calm by force alone. You were sent away on a border campaign the same week. By the time you returned, the accusations had already spread through 6 sections. My rooms had been searched. My correspondence seized. Every witness willing to speak on my behalf had either vanished or changed their testimony. And I believed them, Cassian said. The words were barely audible. Evander said nothing. Cassian stood so abruptly the stool scraped hard against the floor. I believed them. And there it was, the first full memory breach. Not just a sensation. A name. Rian Chiu, Evander confirmed softly. Your sect brother. The one you trusted enough to call family. He'd been helping broker spirit routes for years. He sold information. He sold artifacts. Eventually he sold children. Cassian staggered back a step as if struck. No, he said, but there was no conviction in it. Only horror and the dawning shape of memory. No, You remember him, Evander said. Cassian put a hand over his mouth. He remembered. Evander saw it in real time. The collapse of certainty. The way grief and disbelief tore across his expression as fragments clicked into place. Rian laughing over shared wine. Rian standing at Cassian's shoulder in white robes. Rian kneeling at a trial months later, solemn and righteous, swearing that Shinwei had forged evidence and fallen into demonic cultivation out of jealousy and ambition. Cassian sank down onto one of the kitchen stools like his knees had stopped working. Evander almost stopped then. Almost. But there was no point in mercy now. Not with the truth this close to daylight. Rian warned the elders that I knew too much, Evander said. They moved my brother before I could reach him. Burned the estate where he'd been kept. Killed the servants. Then they accused me of experimenting with forbidden methods and murdering my own father for inheritance. Cassian looked up, eyes glass-bright with disbelief. You didn't tell me. I tried. Evander's voice remained calm by force alone. You were sent away on a border campaign the same week. By the time you returned, the accusations had already spread through 6 sections. My rooms had been searched. My correspondence seized. Every witness willing to speak on my behalf had either vanished or changed their testimony. And I believed them, Cassian said. The words were barely audible. Evander said nothing. Cassian stood so abruptly the stool scraped hard against the floor. I believed them. This time there was no question in it. Memory had arrived in full enough force to make his face go bloodless. Evander remembered that day too. The trial courtyard crowded with elders and disciples. The chains at Shinwei's wrists. Cassian arriving travel-worn and furious. Too late to stop the proceedings. Just in time to hear a dozen voices insist that the man he loved had become a monster. "I didn't believe all of it," Cassian said, voice breaking. "I remember that. I remember looking at you and knowing something was wrong. But you wouldn't talk to me. You wouldn't explain." Evander laughed, and this time the sound was tired rather than cruel. "Explain what? That my brother was still alive somewhere beneath the mountain while the elders threatened to kill him if I spoke? That every word out of my mouth would condemn him faster." Cassian froze. "The trial wasn't about me," Evander said softly. "It was leverage. They knew I'd burn the world down for him if I had to, so they gave me a choice. Confess to enough crimes to justify exile and surveillance, or they'd dispose of the boy and make sure I never found the body." Cassian stared at him. Thunder rolled beyond the windows. "You chose the confession," he whispered. "I chose time," Evander corrected. "I thought if I let them brand me a villain, they'd stop looking at me long enough for me to find him." His smile was a thin, bitter thing. "I was wrong about many details, not about that one." He told Cassian what happened next, and with every sentence the old shape of Shen Wei rose more clearly from the grave. Exile had not humbled him. It had weaponized him. He built networks in the shadows because the righteous world had shut its gates in his face. He learned demonic and unorthodox methods because orthodox men had used morality as a leash and a knife. He stole, bribed, blackmailed, threatened, and killed because every trail toward his brother led through powerful people who only understood force. Rumors multiplied. Fear became useful. Shen Wei let the world call him a villain because villains were allowed to survive in ways wrong sons were not. And all the while Cassian hunted him. Not always to kill. Not always even to stop him. Sometimes just to find him. To drag him into a room and demand answers. To look at the man Shen Wei was becoming and search for the one he had once loved under all the blood and fury and grief. "We met over and over for 5 years," Evander said. "In ruined temples. On battlefields. At negotiation tables where both of us knew the peace would last exactly until one side blinked. You kept asking me to tell you the truth." He looked down at his hands. "I kept refusing." "Because of your brother," Cassian said. Evander nodded once. "He was alive," he said. "For most of those years, he was alive. Every time I got close, they moved him. Every time I cornered one of the men involved, another sect buried the evidence. And you—" He stopped, exhaled. "You kept trying to save me while I was trying to tear half the cultivation world open with my bare hands." Cassian's eyes were red now, memory and present grief bleeding together until Evander could barely tell which expression belonged to which life. "Did I ever hurt you?" Cassian asked. The question was so naked Evander almost looked away. "Yes," he said honestly. "And no." Cassian swallowed. "You fought me," Evander said. "You stopped me more than once. You chose your sect over me in public because you had to if you wanted to keep any power at all. Sometimes I hated you for it. Most of the time I hated myself for still wanting you to touch me afterward." A humorless smile brushed his mouth. "You were very inconvenient." Cassian made a broken sound that might have been a laugh if it hadn't hurt so much. Evander went still again. "The end came when I finally found where they'd hidden my brother." Cassian's head snapped up. "It was beneath the Jade Hollow archives," Evander said. "An old prison complex under the mountain. By then the experiments had moved beyond spirit extraction. They were trying to create vessels, cultivators who could absorb unstable cores and survive long enough to be weaponized." Cassian's face emptied of all color. "My brother was one of the last survivors," Evander said. "He wasn't 13 anymore. He was 18. And he was dying." The rain seemed louder suddenly. Evander remembered every second of that night with the clarity of a wound that had never scarred. The tunnels under the mountain. The iron stink of blood and alchemical rot. The prison doors hanging open after his people cut through them. The row of cells. The bodies. And in the last chamber, his brother. Too thin, too pale. Eyes burning fever-bright in a face that still carried echoes of their father. Alive only because the thing growing inside his core had not decided to kill him yet. "He knew me," Evander said, voice thinning around the memory. That was the cruel part. He knew me. He smiled when he saw me. He said he knew I'd come. Cassian covered his face with one hand. I couldn't save him, Evander said. No matter how many times he had relived it, the words never got easier. The experiments had ruined his meridians. The core they'd implanted was unstable. If I moved him too quickly, it would rupture. If I left him there, the sect would reclaim him by morning. So I did the only thing I could. Evander's throat tightened. I stayed with him while he died. Cassian made a sound of raw grief. Evander looked at the city because looking at Cassian was suddenly impossible. When the core ruptured, it destroyed half the prison level, he said. The explosion exposed the archives above us. Records, bodies, spirit cages, enough evidence to damn every elder involved. By the time the sects understood what had happened, the mountain was already burning. Now Cassian was crying. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just silent tears slipping down a face gone stricken with memory. Evander should have stopped. He did not. After that there was no going back, he said. The elders panicked. Some fled. Some tried to bury the evidence again. I decided if they wanted a villain, I would give them one memorable enough to survive history. And so Shinwei became the monster they feared. He weaponized the evidence, extorted sect leaders, crippled trade routes, exposed enough corruption to start a war and enough lies to make sure no one could contain it. In the chaos, old alliances collapsed. Righteous heroes drew swords. Entire mountains changed hands in blood. Cassian remembered all of that now. Evander could see it in his face. But he still did not remember the final cruelty. So Evander gave him that too. The cliff, he said quietly. The night I died. Cassian went rigid. That wasn't the end of a battle, Evander said. It was the end of a bargain. He told him the last truth. When the war reached its ugliest point, the surviving elders made one final move. They threatened to release every sealed experiment record in a way that would implicate the lower disciples and branch families who had known nothing, turning the entire cultivation world into a bloodbath of retaliatory purges. Worse, they had one final unstable spirit core, one strong enough to collapse the mountain range if detonated in the right place. Shinwei struck a deal. He would take the core and draw the sect armies away from the archives. He would let the world believe he meant to use it as a weapon. In exchange, his spies would smuggle the evidence to neutral territories and force a public reckoning once the immediate threat was gone. I never intended to survive it, Evander said. Cassian's face crumpled. No, he said. Yes. No. Evander's voice stayed quiet. You were never supposed to catch up to me on the cliff. I had arranged the route to keep you away. Cassian looked at him with the wild, horrified eyes of a man remembering exactly how that failure had felt. You still came, Evander said. Of course you did. You always ruined my plans by caring too much. He remembered the storm, the broken mountain path, the spirit core screaming inside the array carved into his own flesh. Cassian arriving bloodied and desperate, sword in hand, demanding that Shinwei stop, demanding explanations, demanding anything but this. He thought I was about to destroy the valley, Evander said. I let him think it. Why? Cassian choked out. Because if you knew I was planning to die, you would have tried to stop me. I would have. I know. Their eyes met. I needed the core far enough from the archives that the blast wouldn't erase the evidence, Evander said. And I needed you alive. If the world was going to survive what came after, it needed a righteous hero still standing in it. Someone people trusted enough to believe when the records surfaced. Cassian was shaking his head before Evander finished. No, he said again, tears falling freely now. No, you don't get to say that like it was reasonable. You don't get to decide alone that dying was the only answer. Evander laughed once, hollow and exhausted. That's the problem with loving me, Cassian. I absolutely do. Cassian looked like he might break. The sword, he whispered. Evander closed his eyes for a second. Yes, because that was the last knife in the wound, wasn't it? Not that Shinwei had fallen. Not even that he had died smiling. It was the sword. Cassian had reached him on the cliff just as the unstable core overloaded. In the chaos, trying to disable the array and drag Shen Wei away from the blast radius, Cassian had struck him. One desperate miscalculation, one blow meant for the formation at Shen Wei's side that landed instead through flesh and bone. Not the killing wound in the end. The spirit core would have done that regardless. But enough blood. Enough horror. Enough guilt to haunt a man into another life. It was an accident, Evander said quietly. You know that now. Cassian made a wrecked, furious sound. I killed you. No, Evander said sharply, the first edge entering his voice in a while. You loved me until the end, and then I manipulated you into being there for my suicide. Those are not the same thing. Cassian flinched as if struck. The room fell silent except for rain. Evander let him have it. He had spent 2 lifetimes carrying this story alone. The Cassian wanted the truth. Then Cassian could stand inside it with him now. At last Cassian spoke, voice shredded raw. Why didn't you tell me? The old question. The same one in a new world. Evander stared out at the storm-dark city and answered with the only honesty he had left. Because by the time I could have, he said. I didn't know how to ask you to stay after everything I'd become. Cassian's breath caught. Evander looked at him then. Really looked. And there he was. The righteous hero reborn as a modern man with rain on his coat and tears on his face. Standing in Evander's kitchen with his heart split open by the past. You loved Shen Wei, Evander said softly. You loved the person I was before the world got hold of me. I couldn't bear the possibility that if you knew the whole truth, you'd look at what was left and decide the monster was all there ever was. Cassian crossed the room in 3 strides. Evander barely had time to inhale before Cassian's hands were on his face, warm and shaking, and then Cassian was kissing him. It was not a gentle kiss. It was desperate, furious, grief-struck, and full of the kind of devotion that made Evander's knees go weak with pure catastrophic memory. Cassian kissed him like a man trying to make up for 2 lifetimes of being too late. Like he could pour apology and love and helpless rage into Evander's mouth until it became enough to rewrite the past. Evander should have pushed him away. He didn't. He kissed him back with all the exhaustion and hunger and buried tenderness he had spent years pretending no longer existed. His fingers knotted in Cassian's shirt. Cassian made a broken sound against his mouth and hauled him closer, one hand sliding to the back of his neck as if he was afraid Evander might disappear if he loosened his grip for even a second. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Cassian pressed his forehead to Evander's and said, voice shaking, Don't you ever do that to me again. Evander, still dazed enough to be honest, murmured, I don't think I can die a second time in this life. It would be terribly repetitive. Cassian laughed and cried at once, which was not a dignified sound but was very much a Cassian sound. He kissed Evander again, shorter this time, as if unable not to. Then he looked at him with red-rimmed eyes and all the devastation of the last hour still carved into his face. I hated myself for years after you died, he said. I remember it now. I remember finding the evidence. I remember the trials. I remember learning what they'd done to your brother and realizing I'd spent all that time asking you for explanations when I should have been tearing the world apart beside you. His voice broke. I remember reaching the bottom of that cliff and knowing there was no one left to apologize to. Evander's chest ached. Cassian touched his cheek as if still convincing himself Evander was real. And now you're here, alive, in my hands. Do you have any idea what that feels like? Yes, Evander said softly. Terrifying, mostly. Cassian let out a breathless laugh. I'm serious. I know. Evander lifted a hand and, after a brief moment of deeply unfamiliar courage, rested it over Cassian's wrist. The pulse there was fast, steady, alive. I didn't bring you here tonight to fix the past, he said. It can't be fixed. Then what did you bring me here for? Evander looked at him for a long moment. Then, because he had already ruined everything else, he answered honestly. To make you understand why loving me is a terrible idea. Cassian stared. Then he leaned in and kissed the corner of Evander's mouth with infuriating softness. No, he said. I understood that the first time. I'm doing it anyway. Evander closed his eyes. Of course you are, he muttered. And that should have been the end of the night. It wasn't. Because the universe, still apparently committed to humiliating Evander Shen in every possible timeline, chose that exact moment for his comm screen to light up with an incoming priority call from the Shen Family Trust. He glanced over automatically. The caller ID read, Orson Shen. Evander and Cassian looked at it. The comm kept ringing. Cassian's expression shifted from grief-struck devotion to something much colder. Evander, still half in Cassian's arms, sighed. I cannot believe my inheritance has chosen this moment to become relevant. Cassian reached past him and declined the call. Then he turned the comm face down on the counter with calm finality and said, If your cousin interrupts one more emotional breakthrough, I'm throwing him into the harbor. Evander stared at him. And then, despite the wreckage of the night, despite the tears still drying on Cassian's face and the ache in his own chest, he laughed. Really laughed. Cassian's expression softened at once, relief flooding through it like sunrise. There, Evander thought with exhausted affection and no small amount of dread, was the real disaster. Not the past. Not the inheritance war waiting at the door. Not even the fact that his righteous hero had remembered enough to break his own heart all over again. No, the real disaster was that Evander Shen, former villain and current trust fund recluse, was standing in his stormlit penthouse laughing in the arms of the same man he had once loved to ruin. And for the first time in a very long time, the future no longer looked empty. Part 6. The last life ends here. Orson called again at 8:13 the next morning. Then again at 8:16. Then, because the man had the spiritual resilience of mold, he sent a message through the Shun Trust office, one through Evander's financial advisor and one, most offensively, through Lin Mei, who marched into the flower shop's upstairs kitchen at 10 in the morning holding her tablet like a weapon and announced that the family had apparently chosen violence before breakfast. Evander, who had slept approximately 3 hours after Cassian finally left the penthouse sometime after midnight, looked up from his coffee with all the enthusiasm of a man being informed of a tax audit during active emotional recovery. No, he said immediately. Lin Mei blinked. No what? No whatever this is. Unfortunately, this is not a negotiable no. She set the tablet in front of him. Your grandfather has called an emergency trustees session for this afternoon. Orson wants a proxy challenge over your Helix bio shares. Evander stared at the message. Then he stared harder. Cassian, sitting at the table with a plate of toast because apparently once you kissed a man in a grief-stricken storm confession. He simply began materializing in your mother's kitchen every morning thereafter, leaned over to read it too. His expression changed. What? Cassian said very evenly. Is a proxy challenge. Evander took a long sip of coffee. It's what rich people do when they're too cowardly to stage duels. Lin Mei, who had accepted Cassian's presence at breakfast with terrifying speed, and had already fed him enough food to imply long-term annexation plans, sighed. Orson's been circling your trust for months. This is just the first time he thinks you're vulnerable enough to force a vote. Cassian looked from her to Evander. Vulnerable how? Evander set his mug down. By upper district standards? I'm 22, uninterested in pretending to enjoy corporate governance, and recently humiliated myself at a public gala by nearly crashing into a floral display. You did not humiliate yourself, Cassian said at once. Evander raised a brow. Cassian, I had to be smuggled upstairs for emergency suppressants like a Victorian heiress with weak nerves. You had a medical issue, Cassian said flatly, and if anyone in that gala judged you for it, I hope their shoes filled with water on the walk home. Lin Mei smiled into her tea. Evander looked at both of them and felt a very specific kind of dread settle into his bones. This was bad. This was family involvement bad. Because one thing more dangerous than Cassian Vale remembering a tragic past-life romance was Cassian Vale, righteous himbo of the modern age, deciding that Evander's current life inheritance battle constituted a problem requiring active intervention. I need everyone in this room, Evander said carefully, to remain calm. Cassian folded his arms. I am calm. That's exactly what worries me. By noon, the the situation had deteriorated. The trustees' meeting would be held at Shen Tower, the family's old corporate headquarters in central Vesper, where 3 generations of Shen money had been converted into glass, steel, biotech holdings, and a level of intergenerational dysfunction that ought to have earned tax penalties. Grandfather Shen had summoned not only the trustees but several extended family members for transparency, which in practice meant he wanted witnesses in case someone made a scene. Orson, apparently, had spent the night whispering to anyone who would listen that Evander's recent instability and socially concerning attachments proved he was unfit to manage his own voting rights. Evander, on hearing this, had become so still that even Lin May put down her tea. Cassian, meanwhile, had gone from calm to ominously pleasant. Socially concerning attachments, he repeated. Evander did not look at him. You see why I wanted everyone calm. Cassian smiled. It was not a reassuring smile. I am going to kill your cousin with impeccable manners, he said. Lin May patted his arm. Wait until after lunch, dear. Evander put his face in his hands. By 1:30, he was standing in his penthouse dressing room in a dark tailored suit while Cassian sat on the chaise by the window tying his own cufflinks and somehow making the simple act look threatening. Evander glanced over. Why? He asked. Are you dressed like a man attending either a board meeting or a public execution? Cassian looked up from his cuff. Whichever happens first. No. Yes. You are not coming. Cassian stood. He crossed the room with the smooth inevitability of a man who had already made up his mind, stopped in front of Evander, and adjusted the fall of Evander's collar with infuriating tenderness. Last night, he said, you told me the full tragic history of your previous life, including the part where you repeatedly sacrificed yourself because the people around you were incompetent and corrupt. Today, your rich relatives are trying to strip your inheritance because they think you're isolated and easy to corner. He met Evander's eyes. I'm coming. Evander opened his mouth. Cassian touched 2 fingers lightly under his chin and tilted his face up just enough to kiss him once. Brief, warm, shameless. Also, Cassian added, your mother already invited me. Evander closed his eyes. Of course she had. Shen Tower rose above the central district like a monument to old money and selective emotional repression. Its upper floors housed the family offices and trust chambers. Its lower levels were a museum of polished stone, private elevators, and staff who had all mastered the Shen family art of pretending not to hear screaming through closed doors. Evander stepped out of the car into the underground arrival bay with Cassian at one side and Lin May at the other and felt, with immediate certainty, that the day had no intention of being merciful. The trustees' chamber occupied the 38th floor. By the time the private lift opened, most of the principal actors were already there. Grandfather Shen sat at the head of the long obsidian conference table, silver-haired and severe in a dark traditional jacket that made him look less like a biotech magnate and more like the kind of ancient aristocrat who would disinherit a son for buying the wrong wine. To his right sat Orson's father, stoic and spineless in equal measure. To his left sat 2 trustees, 1 legal advisor, and a family physician Evander had not seen since he was 16 and pretending not to be miserable at charity galas. Orson himself was standing near the windows with a tablet in one hand and the expression of a man who believed he had arranged his victory carefully enough to enjoy it. Then he saw Cassian walking in beside Evander. His face tightened. Good, Evander thought. Suffer. Evander, Grandfather Shen said. Not unkindly but with the clipped reserve of a man who had been raised to regard affection as a negotiable weakness. You're late. I'm 2 minutes early, Evander said. Grandfather glanced at the clock, found this to be true, and looked mildly displeased anyway. His gaze moved to Cassian. And this is? Before Evander could answer, Lin May smiled sweetly. Cassian Vale. He's with Evander. Silence. Absolute, ringing silence. Evander turned his head toward his mother with the slow horror of a man witnessing a public assassination. Lin May smiled back serenely. Cassian, to his credit, did not miss a beat. He stepped forward and offered his hand to Grandfather Shen with the confidence of a man either very brave or fundamentally disconnected from self-preservation. Cassian Vale, he said. It's a pleasure to meet you. Grandfather Shen looked at the offered hand for 1 beat too long. Then, perhaps deciding that murdering people in front of trustees was still frowned upon, he shook it. Orson made a small disgusted noise. Evander, who was already tired, sat down before he committed a felony. The meeting began badly and somehow managed to worsen from there. Orson's argument, when stripped of its expensive vocabulary, amounted to this: Evander was too disengaged, too young, too personally compromised, and too medically unpredictable to retain unilateral control of the voting shares he had inherited through his father's line. For the good of the family portfolio, those shares should be placed under temporary co-management, specifically under Orson's supervision, until Evander demonstrated stable governance participation. It was, Evander thought, one of the more creative attempts at theft he had seen in either lifetime. The trustees listened. The legal advisor nodded at all the appropriate moments. Grandfather Shen watched Evander's face with that cold old gold stare that had intimidated bankers, rivals, and at least one provincial minister into changing course. Cassian sat beside Evander in dangerous silence. Then Orson made the mistake. He lifted his tablet, brought up a series of stills from the gala security feed, and said, in the tone of a man performing public service, "Given recent incidents, I believe it's prudent to ask whether my cousin is managing his suppressants responsibly." Several witnesses reported an episode significant enough to require private intervention and removal from the ballroom. The room went still. Lin May's expression hardened instantly. Evander felt something inside him turn to ice. There it was. The humiliation, the implication, the very deliberate attempt to drag his body, his privacy, and his medical history into a boardroom so Orson could leverage them into control. In another life, men had used his brother's suffering to force his hand. In this one, Orson had apparently decided that public degradation would do. Evander set down his pen. Cassian's chair moved. The sound was quiet, but it made every head in the room turn. Cassian stood. There was nothing visibly aggressive about him. No raised voice, no dramatic gesture. Just a broad-shouldered man in a dark suit resting one hand on the back of his chair and looking at Orson with the kind of calm that made sensible people reconsider all their life choices. "I have a question," Cassian said. Orson, who had not yet learned from the gala, smiled thinly. "This is a trustees' session, not a group therapy circle." Cassian ignored him. "Did you obtain my partner's medical information with his consent?" Evander's brain stopped for a moment. So, apparently, did the rest of the rooms. "My partner." Cassian had said it in the same tone one might use for "the weather is mild today" or "please pass the salt." Casual. Certain. Entirely unbothered by the fact that he had just detonated a verbal explosive in the middle of Shen Tower. Lin May looked down at the table very quickly, which was how Evander knew she was trying not to grin. Orson blinked. "You're what?" Cassian's expression did not change. "Answer the question. You have no standing here." "I have enough standing to ask whether you're publicly discussing a private medical event because you care about fiduciary governance," Cassian said, "or because humiliating Evander in front of his family is the only strategy you have left." Orson's face flushed. "Be careful," he snapped. "You don't know how this family works." Cassian's mouth curved. "No," he said, "but I know bullies. They're all structurally boring." Evander, despite himself, felt a vicious spark of pleasure. One of the trustees coughed into his hand to hide what might have been a laugh. Orson's expression darkened. "This has nothing to do with bullying. Evander's condition makes him volatile." Cassian's gaze sharpened. "Say condition again, and I'll start using words your legal advisor will hate." Grandfather Shen, who had watched the entire exchange in silence, finally spoke. "Mr. Vale," he said, "are you under the impression that this is helping?" Cassian turned toward him, and to Evander's deep alarm, his face softened. Not with fear, not with deference, with that maddening, earnest sincerity he deployed when he decided to be devastating. "Yes," Cassian said, "because with respect, sir, your grandson is being treated like a liability in a room full of people who benefit from him believing that's all he is." Silence again. Grandfather Shen looked at him for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he looked at Evander. "What do you say to the challenge?" the old man asked. The room shifted. Evander understood immediately what had happened. Grandfather, who had tolerated Orson's theatrics long enough to gauge the room, was handing the floor back to its rightful owner. Not out of softness, out of strategy. He wanted to see whether Evander would retreat, deflect, or strike. Unfortunately for Orson, Evander had once been a villain feared across an entire cultivation world. One spoiled cousin and a conference table were not going to frighten him. He rose slowly from his chair. The room's attention settled on him like weight. Evander smoothed one cuff and looked at Orson with the cool, detached interest of a man deciding whether something was worth stepping on. "You're right," he said. "I have been disengaged." Orson's smile began. Evander continued before it could settle. "I let the family assume that because I dislike these meetings, I don't understand what happens in them. I let you mistake disinterest for weakness. That was lazy of me." The smile vanished. Evander turned to the nearest display screen and tapped it awake with his tablet. 3 files appeared at once: financial reports, voting logs, and a series of flag transfer authorizations from shell entities linked to one of the Shen biomedical subsidiaries. Orson went still. Cassian, beside him, looked delighted. "I didn't attend last quarter's governance review," Evander said conversationally, "but I did notice that someone has been trying to siphon licensing revenue from the Helix Bio neuroadaptive patent portfolio into 2 offshore vehicles registered through a Valecrest intermediary." One trustee sat forward. The legal advisor frowned. Orson's father looked suddenly ill. Evander brought up the second file. "Those vehicles, interestingly, are connected to a private investment group where Orson holds a concealed beneficial stake through his mother's side. Which means that while my cousin has been loudly expressing concern about my fitness to manage my shares, he has also been attempting to devalue the same assets so he can reacquire them through a discount proxy route after forcing a co-management vote." The room erupted. Not loudly. Shen family money was too old for that. But voices rose. Trustees began speaking over one another. The legal advisor demanded to see the filings. Grandfather Shen did not move at all, which was somehow the most frightening reaction available. Orson looked at Evander in naked disbelief. "You've been spying on me." Evander smiled. "Please, if I were spying on you, you wouldn't know until your passport stopped working." Cassian made a choking noise that was definitely laughter. Lin-Mei reached for her tea with the serene air of a woman who had long expected her son to verbally eviscerate someone before lunch. Orson recovered enough to lunge for outrage. "Those filings prove nothing. Then you won't mind if the trustees hand them to external counsel and freeze every related account until the audit concludes," Evander said. Orson said nothing. That was answer enough. Grandfather Shen steepled his fingers. "Is there more?" Evander met his gaze. There was, in fact, a great deal more. Enough to ruin Orson comprehensively. Enough to scorch his father by association and trigger a month of forensic review across 3 family subsidiaries. Evander considered it. Then, because he was trying, however badly, to become a better man in this life than he had been in the last, he let the pause stretch and chose mercy sharpened into warning instead of annihilation. "Yes," he said, "but I imagine my cousin has suddenly developed a renewed respect for restraint." Orson looked as though he wanted to kill him. Cassian looked as though he'd be happy to supervise. The trustees voted within 20 minutes. The challenge was dismissed unanimously. Orson's access to all family-linked investment vehicles was suspended pending review. External counsel was retained. The legal advisor requested copies of Evander's evidence with the reverence of a man staring at a loaded weapon and realizing too late that it had never been unloaded in the first place. By the time the meeting adjourned, the room's atmosphere had changed entirely. People stood when Evander stood. The older trustee who had barely spoken to him in years asked if he would consider attending the next strategy session. Orson's father could not look him in the eye. Orson himself left without a word. All the smug polish burned clean off his face. Cassian waited until the doors sealed behind the last trustee. Then he turned to Evander with an expression of pure wonder. "That," he said, "was the hottest thing I've ever seen." Evander blinked. Lin-Mei made a scandalized sound that contained absolutely no real scandal. "Cassian," she said, half laughing. "What?" Cassian asked, entirely sincere. He just dismantled a hostile proxy challenge with a 5-slide presentation and one threat about passport access. I'm only human. Evander felt heat rise up his neck with appalling speed. This, he said, is not the takeaway. It's one of the takeaways. Grandfather Shen cleared his throat. Every head turned. The old man was still seated at the head of the table, hands folded over his cane, his expression unreadable. He looked at Evander first, then at Cassian, then finally at Lin Mei, whose face had settled into the calm alertness of a woman prepared to bite anyone who misbehaved. At last Grandfather Shen said, "Walk with me." It was not addressed to anyone in particular, but his gaze was on Evander. The private terrace outside the chamber overlooked the central harbor. Rain had stopped by then, leaving the city washed clean and silver under a pale break in the clouds. Air traffic moved between towers in lines of light. Far below, the water reflected the skyline in fractured gold. Grandfather Shen stood beside the railing for a long moment before speaking. "You look like your father when you're angry," he said. Evander leaned against the stone balustrade and said nothing. "He would have handled today badly," Grandfather continued. "Too much pride, too much appetite for humiliation as punishment. He would have made an example of Orson and regretted the collateral damage later." Evander looked over. "And I handled it well?" "You handled it like someone who knew exactly where to place the knife." There was no praise in the words, but there was perhaps recognition. Grandfather's gaze moved out over the city. "I let you disappear into your mother's world because I thought forcing you into mine would break something I did not know how to repair. Perhaps that was cowardice." Evander went still. It was, he thought, the closest thing to an apology he was ever likely to receive from the old man. "Or perhaps," Grandfather said, "it was the only kindness I knew how to offer." The harbor wind tugged at Evander's hair. He thought of another life, another father, another house full of men who had loved badly and called it duty. He thought of the ways power twisted tenderness into something harder, less survivable. He thought of all the versions of himself who had stood at the edge of family and not known whether stepping closer would save him or cost him something vital. At last he said, "I'm not joining the family business." Grandfather huffed what might, in another man, have been a laugh. "No, you'd be intolerable at it." "I can attend meetings," Evander said. "Enough to keep people from mistaking silence for absence. But I'm not spending my life in this tower." Grandfather nodded once. "Reasonable." He glanced back through the glass wall toward the conference chamber, where Cassian was visible in profile talking to Lin Mei with animated hands and the expression of a man who had never once in his life understood the concept of emotional moderation. "That one," Grandfather said after a pause, "is he permanent?" Evander nearly choked on air. "I beg your pardon." "Your mother introduced him as though wedding invitations were already being drafted," Grandfather said dryly. "I am asking whether I should prepare myself." Evander stared at him. Then, because the universe had apparently decided every member of his family would conspire to destroy his dignity in one coordinated campaign, he looked through the glass at Cassian laughing over something Lin Mei had said and felt his chest tighten with a tenderness he no longer had the energy to deny. "I don't know," he said at last. It was the truth. He didn't know how permanent anyone could promise to be after 2 lifetimes of losing and finding each other in blood and smoke and modern kitchens. He didn't know what it meant to build something soft after so much violence. He didn't know whether loving Cassian in this life would heal the old wound or simply teach them how to carry it differently. But he knew he wanted to try. Grandfather studied him for a moment and seemed to find the answer in his face anyway. He said, which, from him, was practically a blessing. By the time Evander and Lin Mei returned to the flower shop that evening, the storm had fully broken. The streets of Vesper gleamed under sunset. Delivery drones zipped overhead. Somewhere down the block a musician was playing violin beneath an awning, while people hurried through the damp gold light carrying flowers, shopping bags, umbrellas, pieces of ordinary life. Cassian followed them upstairs carrying 2 bakery boxes, 3 shopping bags, and a potted plant Lin Mei had somehow convinced him Evander needed for emotional ambience. I do not need emotional ambience, Evander said as Cassian set the plant on the kitchen windowsill. Everyone needs emotional ambience, Lin-mei replied. Cassian nodded solemnly. Your mother's right. My mother, Evander said, has turned both of you against me. No, Lin-mei said. I've simply arranged the household according to my values. Your values are chaos and matchmaking. Exactly. Dinner happened in the way more and more things seem to happen lately, with very little discussion and an alarming amount of inevitability. Lin-mei made noodles. Cassian chopped vegetables under her supervision with the focused earnestness of a man trying to earn permanent domestic residency. Evander sat at the counter pretending not to enjoy the sight of them moving around his childhood kitchen as if this were ordinary. It was not ordinary. That was the point. The future still frightened him. Past life memories still surfaced at inconvenient moments. In the scent of rain, in the angle of moonlight, in the pressure of Cassian's hand at the small of his back when he passed too close in the narrow kitchen. There were still truths to untangle, griefs to revisit, apologies to survive. Cassian woke from bad dreams now that his memories were returning more fully. Evander had his own. Some nights one of them reached across the bed they were not yet sharing and found only empty sheets and silence. But that evening, after Lin-mei had gone downstairs to close the shop and Cassian stayed behind to help wash dishes despite Evander's repeated claims that the dishwasher existed for a reason, the kitchen settled into a soft warm quiet. Cassian handed him a towel. Evander took it. For a while they worked in companionable silence, passing plates and glasses between them under the yellow pool of light over the sink. Then Cassian said, without looking up, I remember more now. Evander's hands stilled around the dish he was drying. Cassian rinsed a bowl and set it aside. Not everything, but enough. The festival dance. The library with the broken roof tile you used to sneak through because you hated the main doors. The way you used to pretend you didn't want me around and then steal half my food if I sat beside you long enough. Evander looked at him. Cassian smiled faintly. You were kind of awful. I was very charming. You were a menace. And yet, Cassian echoed, turning off the water. He dried his hands and stepped closer until there was only a breath of space between them. Evander's pulse picked up. Cassian reached out, tucked a loose strand of hair behind Evander's ear, and looked at him with that same impossible steadiness that had undone him in 2 different lives. I remember enough to know I loved you before you became the villain, Cassian said softly, and enough to know I loved you after. Evander's throat tightened. Cassian's thumb brushed once over his cheekbone. So I need you to hear me very clearly, Evander Shen, because I don't think anyone said this to you in a way you believed. His voice lowered. There is no version of you I would have left behind on purpose. The room went quiet. Somewhere downstairs, Lin-mei laughed at something a customer said. A train passed in the distance with a low magnetic hum. The city kept moving around them, vast and glittering and indifferent. Inside that little kitchen above a flower shop, Evander felt the final splinter of something old begin to give way, not vanish. He did not believe in wounds vanishing. Some griefs remained part of the architecture, but soften, perhaps, shift, stop cutting quite so deep when touched. You say very dangerous things in my mother's kitchen, he murmured. Cassian smiled. Should I save them for your penthouse? No. The acoustics there are worse. Cassian laughed. Then, with all the courage of a man who had once chosen death over vulnerability and was trying very hard not to make a habit of it, Evander reached up, caught the front of Cassian's shirt, and kissed him first. Cassian made a startled sound and then melted into it immediately, hands sliding around Evander's waist with such relieved devotion that Evander nearly lost the ability to stand on principle. The kiss deepened slowly, warmly, with none of the desperation of the penthouse confession and all the tenderness of something chosen in the daylight. When they broke apart, Cassian rested his forehead against Evander's and smiled that stupidly soft smile that should have been illegal. Does this mean I can call you my partner in front of your relatives without you threatening me? It means, Evander said, still slightly breathless, that if you become unbearable about this, I reserve the right to bite. Cassian brightened. That's the most omega thing you've ever said to me. Evander stared at him. Then he elbowed him hard enough to make him laugh. Weeks later, Lin Mei would claim she knew exactly when it became official. Grandfather Shen, who pretended to know nothing and somehow knew everything, would send Evander an absurdly expensive tea set for the penthouse that arrived with no note and therefore somehow conveyed more emotion than a letter would have. Orson would avoid eye contact at family events and discover that shame was, in fact, a growth experience. The trustees would learn very quickly that Evander's refusal to attend every meeting did not mean he had stopped paying attention. Cassian would begin keeping a drawer of clothes at the penthouse, then a second drawer, then his running shoes by the front door as if territorial expansion were a natural law. The memories would keep coming. Some of them were cruel. Some of them were sweet. Some arrived in the middle of the night and left one or both of them shaking. But they faced them together now, on the penthouse balcony with the city spread beneath them, in Lin Mei's kitchen over tea, tangled half awake in expensive sheets while rain hit the windows and the past felt too close to the skin. And slowly, with all the awkwardness and tenderness of two people learning how to survive each other in a gentler world, they built something new. Not a replacement for what had been lost. Something after. One evening near the start of winter, Evander stood on the balcony of his penthouse wrapped in a dark robe with a cup of tea warming his hands. The city below was strung with holiday lights, the harbor bright with reflected gold. Inside, Lin Mei was loudly criticizing Cassian's attempt to decorate a small synthetic winter tree, while Cassian defended himself with the solemnity of a man who believed asymmetrical ornaments were a valid artistic choice. Evander listened to them bicker through the half-open balcony doors and felt, not for the first time, that fate had a cruel sense of humor. In one life, he had died on a cliff with blood in his mouth and love unfinished in his chest. In this one, he had inherited a fortune, a meddling mother, a ridiculous amount of property, and the same heroic fool all over again, except this time the fool wore knit sweaters, made breakfast, threatened corporate cousins on his behalf, and looked at him like the world had finally returned something precious. Cassian appeared in the doorway, hands shoved into the pockets of a soft gray sweater, hair falling into his eyes. Your mother says if I put the silver ornaments on the left side again, she'll disown me from a family I'm not technically part of. Evander took a sip of tea. A devastating loss. Cassian stepped onto the balcony and slid an arm around his waist from behind, warm and solid against the winter air. He tucked his chin over Evander's shoulder and looked out at the city with him. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Cassian very quietly said, "Do you still think this is a terrible idea?" Evander leaned back into him. The harbor lights trembled on black water. Somewhere inside, Lin Mei was still muttering about ornament placement like the fate of civilization depended on it. He thought of Xin Wei on the cliff, alone and bleeding and convinced that love could only end in ruin. He thought of all the years between then and now, all the grief, all the unfinished apologies, all the ways they had found each other anyway. Then he turned his head just enough to brush a kiss against Cassian's jaw. "Yes," he said. Cassian made an offended noise. Evander smiled into the night. "But," he added, and felt Cassian go still in anticipation. "I think I'd like to keep doing it." Cassian's arms tightened around him at once. There was a beat of silence. Then, in a voice so openly happy it made Evander's chest ache, Cassian said, "Good, because I'm pretty sure your mother already picked our wedding flowers." Evander closed his eyes. "Of course she did." Cassian laughed and kissed his temple. Inside the apartment, Lin Mei called, "I heard that, and yes, I absolutely did." Evander stared at the skyline and considered, not for the first time, whether disappearing into the sea might still be an option. Then Cassian laughed against his shoulder, warm and alive in here, and the thought dissolved before it could become anything real. Below them, Vesper City burned bright against the dark. Behind them, home waited with warm lights and bickering and badly decorated holiday trees, and a future Evander had never expected to want. His last life had ended on a cliff. This one, he thought, leaning back into the man who had found him again, could end much more embarrassingly. Surrounded by flowers, family, and a hero who refused to let him go. For once, Evander found that he didn't mind.
Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more manhwa style stories. Comment your favorite moment.